Hi everyone, and welcome to our Solventure webinar. I hope you're all doing great and that you're ready for another online session. My name is Katrijn Antierens. I'm a happy member of the Solventure marketing team, and I see some new names in our audience. So for those who already know Solventure and our webinar format, please bear with me while I give a very short introduction of Solventure. So who's Solventure? We are an expert in sales and operations planning. We help our customers with improving their S&OP toolkit, the analytics, the different planning processes. And of course, we want to make sure to level up the skills of all people involved. So these 4 pillars, people, process, tools, and analytics, are very important to us. So we look for different ways to share this vision and this knowledge with you. And that's also the reason why we're actively organizing different webinars. In today's webinar, our host will talk about the relevant ranges within our supply chain and how we can survive in a continuously changing environment. So I'm happy to introduce my colleague, Kilian Vincke. He will guide you through his presentation, and he also looks forward to receiving your input as well. So as a practical tip, before I hand over to Kilian, if you have any questions or comments during the presentation, don't hesitate to use the question box in your control pane. We have reserved some time for Q&A during the presentation, so don't hesitate. Let's get started. Okay, Kilian, I'll give the word back to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yes. Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Katrijn. And I'm very happy to be part of this webinar series that we're organizing. As you've seen, we had 2 in the past couple of weeks, and I think there's another one lined up for next week. So very excited to share some knowledge with you today regarding the battle of the ranges, battle of supply chain ranges. I'll come back to that, but first, the modern VUCA world. What is happening, and what does this VUCA mean? So VUCA, very simple, volatility. This is the speed at which events currently are happening all around us, and I think COVID-19 obviously being one of those elements, really gambling with our lives at the moment and gambling with our supply chains. Next, you've of uncertainty. Uncertainty is some of the decision making, for example, of the government, some of the elements that we can't really see coming. What else is going to happen with COVID-19? And nobody saw it coming before, so this type of uncertainty is very difficult for supply chains to deal with. Another element is complexity. The modern world is more and more connected. We've seen the virus coming up in China, pushing supply back then, moving to Europe and to the US. Well, China is back on the rise now. Their demand is dropping. So demand and supply globally connected, leading to a lot more complexity than it was before. And of course, the last element, ambiguity. And ambiguity is an interesting one. Although we live in an era of massive amount of data, it is sometimes very difficult to understand which of the data is relevant and which of the data can be used to make actual value-adding decisions. So this is a short introduction on really what is happening today, and how do we relate to that Solventure? Well, the concept is maybe already known for a few people. But I'll be happy to just briefly touch upon it again. Our CEO and dear Professor Bram de Smet has written a very interesting book, and I actually have it here with me, on supply chain strategy and financial metrics. And in that book, he explains the concept of the supply chain triangle, basically existing out of 3 elements: service, and I would interpret service quite broadly. You're not talking only by on time in full, but you're also talking definitely about the product portfolio, for example, the elements that help you to drive the top line. Then cost. I think cost is quite an obvious one, often related to operational expenses which happen in a supply chain. And on the other hand is cash. And I think the most obvious example of cash in a supply chain is the inventory that we hold. All right, so what is the goal? Obviously, the long-term goal for supply chain is to optimize, to maximize the ROCE, the return on capital employed. Now, what does this mean? First of all, you obviously start from, sorry about that. So you obviously start from a top line, which drives the volume, which drives the income of a company. Next to that is connected to the cost related to it. If you add the cost to the mix, you become the EBIT, which is a classical sort of benchmark for companies. And the last element, and this is I think where it becomes even more interesting, is the return on capital employed. Now you don't want to just drive any EBITDA. You want to make sure that you reach that EBITDA with the potentially lowest cash involved. So you want to benchmark companies based on not only what profit do they make, but also what profit do they make based on the amount of money that's been invested. So it gives you a good benchmark for companies to balance and to really visualize their supply chain performance one against the other. Now, let's have a look at some of the elements that can influence that triangle. And I think a good example, for example, is a sourcing decision to move to the Far East. Typically is a decision driven to reduce cost, but at the same time, it might have a huge impact on the cash because you might have to invest in working capital to keep stock on the way. Another example is increase market share by extending a product portfolio. Now, obviously, you have the sales organization driving the service or top line up, but and again, we need to be careful. That might have an increase on cost, and it might also have a pressure on the amount of cash is used. So the question is, are we really driving return on capital employed when we make the decision to extend the product portfolio, or are we just eroding the total structure of the company? Another element could be, and then we're already coming to some elements of crisis as well, is reduction of inventory by, for example, in this case, lowering safety stocks. And I've seen that myself in the past, can be done quite bluntly. What will happen? Obviously, there is a cash reduction, and that is that might help to achieve some of the results. But at the same time, you might have a short or even a long-term impact on the top line, on the service level, and you might even have some costs that go up. You might have some expediting and stuff going on to fix some of the gaps that you've created yourself. So it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And what is causing these type of events, or what is happening? Why is this not coordinated? Why companies not making these type of decisions informedly? Well, one of the issues in this case is that the different departments are acting like silos. So they have different targets, they have different incentives. So basically, they're not really aligned. They're purchasing. He wakes up in the morning and thinks, "Oh, I'm going to achieve the lowest unit cost today." At the production, while he's driving to work, he might say, "Oh, but I'm going to increase my OEE today, or I'm going to look at making this as lean as possible." While supply chain is much more concerned about how much inventory am I holding, or what kind of logistics cost am I balancing. Sales might not even care. They might say, just fly it in, create a turnover, beat the market share without even thinking about all the other effects that they have on the other departments. And then you have the finance department, the CFO, who probably also speaks a complete different language, who often does not understand any of the other departments, and is very often not even understood by the other departments as well. Talks about free cash flow and earnings per share. So the connection between those departments gets a little bit lost. Now, what does this create? Sales might drive service up, at the expense of cash and cost. Operations or purchasing might drive cost down, but this might have an impact also on service or on cash. And then you have typically finance, who's very concerned about cash and who's fighting against all the other departments. This is the type of pressure you get within a company, but also within the business model that company is trying to establish, and the way this triangle can be calculated. Then obviously now we have some additional shocks coming in. A lot of companies have been affected by COVID-19, and we see typical events like we've seen also in the crisis. We've seen that some companies have been really affected, and let me just move on slide forward here. Some of the events and some of the examples we already received from customers. Demand might have a steep increase, but other companies and that might have a cause, for example, short-term hoarding or whatever events that are happening. Some other companies are really fighting for the top line, fighting to keep that sales going. And other companies that might actually be really confused about what the actual demand signal is. For other companies, they're really struggling with demand. Some companies have supply issues. They can't get their product into the market. Or they can get the product there, but they need to start expending a lot more and creating costs they don't usually do. For other companies, it's save any cost possible, just complete stop production, which is obviously with fixed costs still running might be a serious threat to the organization. And similar events on cash, on the cash angle and the inventory. What are you sending as a signal to your suppliers when you reduce your inventory or when you temporarily boost up your inventory? So there's various effects on any of the angle of the triangle that needs to be taken into account and that have this short-term threat. In any case, our advice is that avoid chaos. If you make certain decisions and you make certain decisions to protect demand, to set up supply, or to track supply, or to monitor your inventory, make sure it is coordinated. It's coordinated internally within your company, but it's also coordinated with external partners and your customers and your suppliers. Because otherwise you might be creating a lot of bullwhip at the moment, which you actually want to avoid, and that's actually making the problem even worse than it already is. So avoid chaos is here, I think, really the aim. So let's have a look. We started by saying, okay, the relevant ranges and what is this battle about. So when we take a look at the triangle, the different processes have different elements at different stages in the supply chain. So and I want to explain that concept a little bit first before really taking on some of the interesting elements that I want to say specifically about DDMRP today. So if you want to make sure that you can that either you balance the triangle or in the short term avoid chaos, what can you do and how can you organize yourself as a company? First, to be able to explain you the framework of the relevant range, I'm using the SCORE model, and I think some of you might already be familiar with the SCORE model. So source, make, deliver, sell. It has been around for quite some time. And in fact, hierarchical planning as such as a concept has been around for quite some time. But I think it's been much more advanced and has been extended significantly in the last decade. So this is looking at one company, obviously connecting multiple companies. One company's cell will be another company's source and vice versa. So first layer is operations, operational layer, very short-term planning, where you typically within one decoupled lead time frequency of the activities might range from a few seconds, minutes, hours, days. Some companies, it might be weeks. It really depends on what type of industry that you're in. And this is really where you replenish your buffers, where you do some of the scheduling activities that might happen. You might move some products within warehouses or between warehouses, and you get those promotional signals in a very short-term range. Now, if you look at the second layer, the tactical layer, I think it is really in this layer where all the communication between what will follow, obviously, the strategical range, but where the strategical targets get translated back to be grounded in the operations and vice versa. So typical elements there that are important. It's often extended beyond the lead time. In certain concepts, it's one lead time back, one lead time forward, but it might be some element somewhere between often 6 to 12 months where tactical decisions can be made. Tactical decisions, typically the fixed costs are still fixed and haven't become variable, but the variable costs can be very well contained. And also typically in that tactical layer, the capacity as such is still fixed. So it's really about optimizing or identifying where you will have capacity issues, making sure that you put mitigations in the plan, and feed that information also to the strategical layer to make sure that the right audience in your company can make those decisions. Typically, that the supply and inventory part is fed by a tactical demand planning process, a demand planning process which I come back later. Which in many cases would be really good if you have a collaborative demand planning. I think that's even stronger. And then you have the strategic layer. Strategic layer, really about those long-term decisions, can often be even in quarters, where you can decide on fixed cost decisions, and where fixed cost decisions become variable. Often also where those budgeting exercises get done, network designs get done. And I'm typically, because if you look at the situations in many companies today, very strategic decisions are probably made on a very short-term tactical operational input that we're receiving. We saw, for example, that Lufthansa decided to put one of their daughters out of business, at least for the time being. That was Germanwings. So those type of strategic decisions can sometimes be made based on very short-term input that there is. So keeping those layers in sync and making sure that the information between the layers is really translating is an essential fact. And it's something that really can help you to steer through this crisis. I'll come back to that in a bit. All right, so it's time for our first poll of the day, and I've now just introduced the three relevant ranges, and let me just have a look at how I can launch this poll. There we go. Then everybody should see that now. Hopefully that is working. And so while I'm just waiting to see a little bit of the output, and I see a few people have already voted, and it's going quite quick there. I'm happy. No, the results are a bit mixed. I think we're well, let's give it a few more seconds, and I can also share that poll with you. To a nice modern technology, and you see that typically here, and that's also a little bit like I expected, that this COVID-19 is hitting very much on that operational level. All right, so let's start by looking at the operational impact and how can we protect that operational layer. Now, I want to share a little bit about my experience, which we had with the DDMRP. Last year, I've written an interesting study for the Vlerick Business School and you can still find the outcome on the link which is attached. It's a demand-driven operating model, a simple 5-step model going from strategic decoupling, which is a first choice with a little bit of a design choice there. Then the main operational component is within the calculation of the buffers. Buffers that are placed in supply chain to make sure that you can dampen the bullwhip effect. And bullwhip effect, that is definitely now something that's coming up in this crisis. Elements of dynamic adjustment, if necessary, to pre-size the buffers. And then the actual planning itself, where you use the net flow equation. So you're not necessarily using the buffers to really plan, but what you're doing is you're calculating your position within the buffers. And if it's necessary to replenish, you trigger the order to make sure that you still have enough buffer left to fulfill the demand to the next buffer. And there's some very visual elements, there's some collaborative execution elements of setting the right priorities and making sure that every stage and every node in the supply chain has a very good idea on which priorities to move forward to. Something that in times where stock becomes scarce, it's definitely something that is very relevant. So these techniques are very useful, and I think even in a traditional sort of replenishment model, some of these EDMRP techniques could already create a short-term effect. Obviously, as an operating model, this can be used standalone, but it has also been taken up in a bigger S&OP vision. And that is what I want to give you a few examples of today. So maybe in the meanwhile, and it will already be legendary, I think, is the toilet paper example. Toilet paper spiked. Everybody thought there would be a shortage, but obviously the total demand of toilet paper in the market is not something that's really going to change all that much. So to protect yourself from that bullwhip, there are certain elements within the demand-driven model that prevent you from that, because you will have the buffers in place. You would have been able to absorb some of these spikes, but also you would have seen them coming. There's the spike threshold, which is one of the operating elements. So you would have been alerted against the fact that you would see this upswing. At the same time, you also need to be careful, even with DDMRP, because in times like this and in crises like this, you get an overload of signals. And you really need to make sure that you can then prioritize the right elements. So I think the prioritization as such is definitely something that is very useful. Obviously, if everything becomes a priority, then you would need some coordination and some human activity to make sure that you can coordinate that and get out of the short-term would you say slump. You might need to switch off buffers or inventory all together and just be purely demand driven and just look at the most important orders for the most important customers. Another example, and we're starting to move up to the elements of the tactical and strategical layer, is where you have the automotive at the moment, the spare parts industry, where you have a complete standstill of the business. And obviously you have the first element of coming to a standstill, where demand driven could help you by making sure that you do not replenish anymore when you still have inventory in the pipeline. So basically helping you to stop the supply chain quicker and make sure you protect yourself from excess. I would say very important also to inform everybody else in the supply chain behind you to make sure that you're all coordinated. If you decide to put your weapons down, at least decide to put your weapons down all at the same time, to making sure nobody is creating any excess upstream, even worse than it probably already is. But where does the real challenge lie? I think the real challenge lies is to think long-term and to think how will these businesses restart. And if you do not have demand, or you have some demand coming back up, it might actually be that you're not prepared for this, because in the meanwhile your buffer calculations would have shrunk, and so you would not really know how much you now need to buffer for this business to restart. And that's why you need to have some kind of strategic or projection, or tactical projection, depending on the horizon that you are looking at. And therefore, some kind of forecasting process is very relevant. And I think there's a very interesting interaction of how the demand-driven S&OP, which is a tactical layer, and adaptive S&OP, which is the strategical layer within the DDMRP content or a way of thinking, has developed into making sure that you can guide the parameters and use some of these projections to prepare yourself for the future, to make sure that you build the right capabilities and that you size your buffers right. Basically, take care of your capacity and make sure that you build those inventories up, and that or start to rebuild them at the right time. The last element, and another example that I wanted to say, is natural market growth. And maybe a funny example of the hand shells, but we all know that this is a new market, so this is booming from where it was before, and it's probably for the next months or even years not going to slow down. So it is very necessary to use these S&OP techniques to make sure that that you are synced and that you have tactically scaled the capacity and the capability between where you are now, or what you're doing now, and how you will conquer this new market growth. All of this and these elements are described in another very interesting book that I read, that is a demand-driven adaptive enterprise. This is, I would say, a very good starting point if you're looking into S&OP answers within the context of the DMRP. And they are currently also organizing a very interesting series of webinars. So I would really recommend you to, as I shared the link, to go and have a look there and see if you can learn some of these principles. So I think it's interesting thoughtware. It's an interesting concept. As Solventure, we have over the years built up relevant S&OP process knowledge in the different layers, and it is very nice to see that that a concept like DDMRP has also developed that complete vision on how an S&OP process and how an organization should really scale and interact between the different relevant ranges. All right, maybe before we sort of move on to some of the more interesting bits on how you can steer your organization into the crisis, I'd like to share some of the insights that we've built over the years on forecasting and how to sync different levels of forecasting. Forecasting, which obviously from a strategic perspective is very relevant to prepare structural decisions and to look at your network, design your network, or make shutdown decisions. Also, some of the elements that we use is what we call leading indicator forecast. We track into the vast amount of data that's available there, which of the elements are correlating to your business. Is your business correlated, for example, to the oil price? Then let's track the oil price, and if you see a change in the oil price, and I think that recently was quite a big one, then okay, what kind of impact will that have on your business 2 to 3 months down the line, and can you learn from that? Secondly, a tactical element in forecasting, and I like to really refer to the enrichment element, the collaborative enrichment, where you work together as a company and you allow your different stakeholders within your company to adjust your forecast, to discuss your forecast, and to build scenario capability. And it's that where you feed information into, for example, capacity planning or inventory strategies, And it's important that that's done with consensus within the company. Does not necessarily mean you're going to use this tactical forecast to drive your operations. Apologies. Your operations might be in need of a completely different type of forecast, or it might have to be steered just by priorities and using buffers like in the DDMRP methodology. So it's about making sure that you have the right vision at the right relevant range, and that you take the right decision, not necessarily causing chaos operationally, but if you're tactically prepared for what's coming, then you can have your right operational processes driving and optimizing the cash and minimizing costs operationally, while you make sure you have those bigger decisions in sync, and you don't miss large opportunities, or you don't drive the company into complete bankruptcy, of course. Then, and that's also what I already indicated, what can we learn from this, from all these relevant ranges, these interactions, and that concept of S&OP. First of all, in a type of crisis like that, we would really recommend to switch Autopilot off. If you're still using the MRP to pass on information directly from customers, and it's running on a very regular basis, and you're still using it to purchase raw materials, be very wary about what's happening. If you get additional big swings in customer demand, all the way up or even all the way down, make sure that you only pass on that information further in the supply chain which is relevant. And make sure that if you have the ability to prioritize, or you have the ability to buffer and to put the buffer structure in place, try that as well. And you can do that in conjunction with your supplier, for example. Secondly, seek coordination, and I think it's important to make sure that if you syncing the different layers, maybe at this point in time you need to sync them differently than they usually are. Some of the processes might be monthly, but given these very uncertain times, maybe you need to increase the frequency to weekly. And I think that's something some companies might have already done. It's maybe interesting to also ask the audience. So maybe I can launch a quick second poll, if you would allow me. I actually quite like this concept. So my second poll, and I've just launched it, is have you changed the frequency of your S&OP meetings? If you have S&OP meetings, obviously we are counting on that, but have you changed the frequency, and how is that currently happening? Because I think that's for us a very relevant question, because we work a lot with S&OP and S&OP processes, and we also want to think about, okay, what are relevant decisions? If you would do it weekly, your meeting or your content might become different. Yeah? So but maybe give it a few more seconds. But I see that I've got already quite a nice input. All right, let's close that. And I'd like to share it with you, obviously. And that is exactly what I expected. And I'm actually happy to see it in a way, but it's also quite a nice challenge, I can imagine, is that most of you have indeed decided to take this from a high level, probably monthly, I would assume, to weekly, or from weekly to daily. So what is important on top of this? You have this, you're clearly doing this already, syncing that decision making much faster, but you also need those scenarios. Scenarios typically decided on a tactical level, optimistic most likely, and sadly also pessimistic or conservative. And with having that, you can leverage that information to your management and make sure that they are very well aware of the impact of different decisions that they make. And then last thing, of course, if you want to steer through a crisis, our advice would be keep on thinking long term. Don't forget that you're in a very connected world, and at the different levels, both operational and strategically, communicate to your customers and your suppliers. All right, let's go to key takeaways. And let me be quite quick. I want to keep just a few minutes for one or two questions. I think when we think about this concept of relevant ranges, make sure you keep on protecting your operational level. A lot of the audience is indeed suffering on that operational layer. Secondly, use the forecast at the relevant level. Make sure that you keep on having that tactical view, and make sure that you sync those frequencies between that operational and that tactical. And above all, keep those S&OP meetings on track. Communication, I think, is the most vital step here. And then, of course, the concept is to protect your return on capital employed. That can mean that sometimes you might have to take different decisions short term, but obviously make sure that you have the relevant strategies in place to protect your return on capital employed in the long term. Very good. So maybe a last quick one. If you're looking for help, please reach out to us. If you are struggling with interpreting the right signals, are you thinking about, okay, how can I use the forecast, or how can I build a forecast? How can I learn from previous crises? Or if you're looking to understand a little bit more about this concept of DD-MRP, that is something that we definitely would be looking forward to sharing opinions. And the last element, scenario capability. Are your current planning systems able to help to handle scenario capability? I would say reach out to us if you have any questions on that, and we will see what we can potentially do both in the short term and in the long term. All right. So well, thank you a lot for your interest, and thank you for your interaction. I'm happy that I was able to launch 2 polls. So let's maybe have a look at quickly if there were some questions, or please type if you have some more questions for myself. Let me see how I can open them. So I already have a first question. Let me just maybe quickly read through it. So we have a strong believer for the supply chain triangle. Thank you very much for that. And there's some desire from a typical company to maximize service, minimize cost, and minimize inventory. How do you deal with this child in a toy store behavior? I think that's a very relevant question, and let me answer it in this way. If you are struggling to try and convince your management or the rest of your organization, we have done something called the strategic benchmark exercise, and what we do is we actually position your business unit or your company within the triangle, and we compare it to the position of your competition. And what is it doing is it gives you leverage point, because you can show to your management like, okay, we're actually doing better than the competition, which obviously is the ideal scenario. But if not, then you can say, well, this other company is doing better, but it's doing better in this way. It's holding in comparison less inventory, or it's holding more inventory, but it's running at a lower cost at a higher top line. So by identifying in different curves and showing the different stakeholders where you are and what you can achieve, also how you've been positioned year over year, and because your position within the triangle might change, you can actually start to convince your top management that they need to have a very specific strategy on how to balance the different elements in the triangle. I think that would be sort of my answer. I hope that that gives you something at least that you can take up. If you would read the book also gives you some tips and tricks how to calculate this and how to actually compare the position of your company against another company. Very good. Thank you very much, everybody. I'll give you the benefit of time of a few minutes extra. I hope to see you successful with those coordination meetings and those S&OP meetings. And please feel free to send us some feedback if you have any. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your attention, and hope you tune in to the next webinar.